arrow shows a reflex arc, is what we are told. So that means that label C, B, D, A, and E are the components or the parts that actually makes up a reflex arc. Before we get into the labeling of those components, let us start by defining what a reflex arc is. So a reflex arc can be simply defined as a path that is taken by a nerve impulse to react to a stimulus. All right. That is basically what a reflex arc is. All right. So we can define it as a path that is taken by a nerve impulse to react to a stimulus or to bring about a reaction to a stimulus. All right. So the parts that you see here from this diagram are actually the parts that makes up a reflex arc. So we have part C right over here. And as you can see, part C is a candle, rather a well-lit candle. And we know that a lit candle is rather hot, right? Now in this case, our candle will act as our stimulus, all right? So this is a stimulus. Now, what does a stimulus do? A stimulus can otherwise be associated with our initiator, all right? Initiator. What does it initiate? It actually initiates a reflex action, all right? A reflex action. Now, of course, looking at this diagram, you can see that we have a hand that is put on top of this well-lit candle. And since we know that this well-lit candle is hot, now what would happen when this hotness or when this hot lit candle becomes intense for this particular human's hand or person's hand, right? This person would remove their hand away from the flame, right? Now, the removal of the hand is rather what we call a reflex, all right, or a reflex action, okay? Now, for the reflex action or for this person to be able to remove their hand away from this lit candle, we actually need these several components, okay, which a reflex arc consists of, okay? So we basically have a stimulus, which in this case is the well-lit candle, a receptor which detects the stimulus, a sensory neuron which acts as our primary transmitter, our connector neuron or our interneuron, our motor neuron which acts as our secondary transmitter, as well as our effector which brings about a response. So these 6 components are actually what makes up a reflex arc, or which makes possible the removal of this hand away from this well-lit candle. All right. Now, looking at this particular line right over here, this line or this particular structure right over here, that is what we call a sensory neuron. All right. We have a sensory neuron. Okay. This sensory neuron is labeled as B, right? That is our sensory neuron. And we have identified a sensory neuron as our primary transmitter. Okay? What is it actually transmitting? It is transmitting the nerve impulses from the receptor, which in this case is our skin. The skin actually detects the heat or the flame or the hotness from this particular well-lit candle, right? Now, when the stimulus is detected, is then converted into a nerve impulse, which will be transmitted by the sensory neuron from the receptor towards the what now? Towards the spinal cord. All right. Now, as you can see, at our spinal cord, we have part A, right? Now, part A is what we call a synapse. All right. Now, a synapse is a microscopic gap that allows the communication between one neuron and the next neuron, all right, between two neurons, right? That is where the nerve impulses are transmitted from one neuron to the next, all right? A synapse, it is a microscopic gap that allows one direction, or that allows the transmission of nerve impulses from one neuron to the next, okay? All right, which is this gap right over here, which is labeled A. We also have this part right over here, right? This part is what we call the connector or the interneuron, right? Now the interneuron, it is in the spinal cord where the interpretation of the nerve impulses is done. All right, so we can basically consider the connector neuron or the interneuron as our interpreter, right? As the sensory neuron transmit the nerve impulses towards the spinal cord, necessary interpretation as per the stimulus is done. After the interpretation of the nerve impulses, the interneuron or the connector neuron transmit the nerve impulses on this second synapse towards the what now? Towards the motor neuron, which is labeled part D. All right, so this is our motor neuron. All right, our motor neuron basically acts as our secondary transmitter. Okay, it acts as our secondary transmitter. What does it transmit? It transmits the nerve impulses. But the difference between it and the sensory neuron in terms of the transmission of the nerve impulses is that the sensory neuron transmits the unprocessed or uninterpreted or the non-interpreted nerve impulses, right, towards the spinal cord, and the motor neuron transmits the interpreted nerve impulses away from the spinal cord. All right, so it acts as our secondary transmitter. It transmits the nerve impulses towards this part right over here, this part which is our muscles, or otherwise known as our effectors. All right, our effectors, which are the muscles, they are basically our reactors. Okay, they react to the interpreted nerve impulses, right? So when they react, they contract, right? When they contract, this person is able to move their hand away from the flame. Okay, so that is basically a reflex action, right? That particular process, guys, is what we call a reflex action. A reflex action which needs a reflex arc, all right? So we cannot have a reflex action without a reflex arc. A reflex arc which is made of what now? Which consists of sensory neuron, a stimulus, a receptor, a sensory neuron, the connector neuron, the motor neuron, and the effector or the muscles, right? That is the reflex arc, right? The efferent neuron, the effectors, as well as the stimulus, is what makes up our reflex arc. All right, so that is pretty much the structure of a reflex arc, guys. All right, so those are the things in which you need to know, right? So we'd have a stimulus. We can have different types of stimulus. We can have a pin. We can have the heat from a well-lit flame or well-lit candle, depending. All right, it depends. Or we can have a ball that is actually being hit towards you. It depends. We can have various and many numerous types of stimulus. All right, but what you need to know is that a reflex action cannot be made possible without a reflex arc, and a reflex arc is made up of or consists of the components such as the stimulus, or rather the receptor, the sensory neuron, connector neuron, motor neuron, as well as the effector. You need to know the functions of these components and how they actually work hand in hand to bring about a response, in this case referred to as a reflex action. That is pretty much it under our lesson today. And until we meet again, stay blessed.